An overgrown and remote road whose shoulders are wandered by restless spirits, a historic hotel hosting ghostly guests who never truly checked out, and a famous mission whose blood-soaked grounds are roamed by the dead after dark await on this list of some of the most haunted places in Texas. Let's jump right in. Hey guys, and thanks for joining me on this exploration of some of the most haunted places in the Lone Star State of Texas. Recognized for its boundless countrysides, fascinating historic landmarks, tasty southern cuisine, famous sports teams, sweeping national park systems, rodeos, and more, this impressively large state also totes its fair share of chilling ghost stories, native legends, old hill folklore, and tremendous campfire tales that go to show that sometimes even the local fables surrounding the great state of Texas are, in fact, bigger. Are you ready to get started? Our first haunt takes us to southeast Texas to a remote and overgrown route known as Bragg Road. Bragg Road, which is situated out of Saratoga, Texas, is an unassuming forest route that, despite its serene setting, is infamous for playing home to one of the state's most well-known hauntings. Historically, following the discovery of a sulfur-smelling spring by one J.F. Cotton through the 1850s, Saratoga was established as the community of New Sour Lake, and in as late as 1865, Cotton would attempt to establish an oil well on site, though this early venture would fail due to inadequate funding and machinery. Later, through the 1880s, one P.S. Watts would profit from the spring using the old snake oil routine by claiming it had special medicinal properties. Watts would change the name of the site to Saratoga, mimicking the earlier resort town of Saratoga Springs in New York, and would even go so far as to construct a hotel and rental cottages. However, very few would visit the region, and this venture would also eventually fail. Years later, oil wells would finally be drilled throughout Saratoga. In 1904, the area would see increased traffic after an extension of the Gulf, Colorado and Santa Fe Railway was constructed right through it and up to Bragg Station. And over subsequent decades, and in the shadow of profitable lumber and oil industries, the town's population would massively fluctuate. Saratoga remains a small center of industry, and even into more recent times, namely through the 1990s, new wells have actually been drilled near. Running just north of Saratoga and through the big thicket forest up to Bragg is the legendary Bragg Road, which harbors some chilling supernatural phenomena. While, unlike our other listed locations here, Bragg Road doesn't necessarily tote a wide range of phenomena, the long-standing local legend surrounding its bounds has grown such an infamy that it easily warrants it a spot on this adventure. As far back as documented history spans, those traveling Bragg Road have reported encounters with a handful of ghostly manifestations that have resulted in dark tourists traveling from far and wide just to experience them firsthand. And most who pay it a visit don't leave disappointed, with tales describing strange spectral animals that skirt the roadway, threatening and inhuman growls heard through car windows after dark, and encounters with a handful of intimidating cryptids. Some who drive the road have described it feeling as if they're traveling forever in a loop and not making any distance. Others have told of phantom voices heard through car radios, of electronics malfunctioning, and of accounts with vehicles spontaneously stalling. And a handful of terrifying documentations detail instances in which those who have stopped to check out certain areas return to their vehicles and are unable to get them started, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere. Easily the most famous phenomenon surrounding Bragg Road tells of the Saratoga Ghost Light, which always appears around the same time every night, and that's been witnessed by pretty much anyone brave enough to go searching for it. While several stories tell this light is either a reflection from a distant roadway bounced off of regional features, some strange natural phenomenon, or likely due to swamp gases, the most popular theory claims the glow is tied to the spirit of a former railroad worker who was decapitated in a train accident, and that the phantom illumination comes from his lantern as he forever searches for his missing head. Our second haunt lands us in the heart of Texas at Austin's famous Driscoll Hotel. The Driscoll Hotel, which is located in Austin, Texas, is a massively famous lodging boasting the titles of being both the oldest operating hotel within its sprawling city, and also as being one of the most well-known hotels in the whole of the state, if not in the country, whose bounds are shrouded in an impressive assortment of ghost stories and local legends. Historically, in 1849, successful cattle baron Colonel Jesse Driscoll would move to Texas from Missouri, and while his main trade was to supply beef to the Confederate Army through the Civil War, once in Austin, he would decide to expand his operations by opening a grand hotel, after which he would purchase a plot off of 6th and Brazos Streets for $7,500. Construction of this prized hotel would conclude by 1886, and later, on December 20th of the same year, it would host its grand opening. However, this venture would be relatively short-lived, as a particularly harsh winter in 1887 would see most of Driscoll's cattle killed off, and following the beach hotel out of Galveston poaching most of his staff for better wages, in early January of 1888, he would sell the property to his brother-in-law, Jim Doc Day, who would reopen the site later that month. Over the years, one George Littlefield would open the Austin National Bank on the corner of the building, and in 1895, he would end up purchasing the hotel for $106,000 and would vow never again to close its doors. However, following massive monetary investments that would result in a net loss of $25,000, in 1903, he too would end up selling the site to competitor L. Wilmot, who would set to work on a series of renovations and upgrades, including the additions of a barbershop, a women's spa and Turkish baths, and of an annex. In 1950, the Driscoll would welcome a slew of renovations. In 1969, it would close its doors in anticipation of the building of a new tower that would never transpire, and would narrowly dodge demolition when the non-profit Driscoll Hotel Corporation raised $900,000 to keep it afloat. And in 1972, Braniff Airways Incorporated would purchase the site and would set to work on further restorations. More recently, in 1995, the Driscoll was purchased under Great American Life Insurance. In 2003, it was sold yet again to Hyatt Hotels, and in May of 2022, it was sold a final time to Dallas-based Woodbine Development, who retains ownership to this day. The Driscoll Hotel remains open into the present, offering some of the most luxurious accommodations across Austin. However, despite its prestigious legacy, it also harbors a darker side, one wrought with tales of supernatural encounters and run-ins with the otherworldly. And both staff and guests to its bounds have reported instances of lights turning on and off by themselves, voices or footsteps heard from empty rooms, and odd malfunctions with personal electronics. One chilling story tells that long ago, a young boy chasing his bouncy ball ended up falling down a set of stairs to his death, and to date, his restless spirit has been known to play harmless pranks on the living, and his small giggles and the sounds of his play are often heard from somewhere just out of sight. In life, President Lyndon B. Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird, were particularly fond of the Driscoll and would stay at the hotel virtually any time they were in Austin. Incidentally, their apparitions have been sighted all about the property, sometimes eating dinner at the bar or walking around together, and at others, dancing intimately in the ballroom. Another famous Driscoll ghost story tells of how, sometime through the early 1990s, a bride-to-be checked into room 329 to await her groom. Sadly, however, her fiancé would end up backing out of the wedding, leaving her to stew through her first day on site. On her second day, the distraught woman would spend $40,000 during an uncontrolled shopping spree, before, on her third day, lining up all of her purchases next to her bed and taking her own life by way of self-inflicted gunshot wound. To date, the restless spirit of this mournful bride has been observed pulling a mountain of shopping bags through the lobby and through various hallways, before either fading away or walking straight through solid walls. Lastly, this weathered old lodging is believed to harbor the phantom of its creator, being that of Jesse Driscoll himself, who has been sighted roaming the property, seemingly keeping an eye over the creation he lost so quickly in life. Alongside greeting guests and attending various events, Jesse seems particularly fond of the rooms whose windows overlook 6th and Brazos, and he has been known to appear to guests within said rooms in the middle of the night, only to gaze longingly over the city he so cherished. And on to number 3, which has us skirting the waters of the Gulf Coast at the iconic USS Lexington. The USS Lexington, or CV-16, which is anchored in Corpus Christi, Texas, is an Essex-class aircraft carrier named after the prominent Battle of Lexington that's long been surrounded by tales of otherworldly activity experienced across her decks. Historically, on July 15th of 1941, our ship in question was laid down as the Cabot by the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. In May of 1942, CV-2, which was also known as the USS Lexington, was destroyed at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and in June of the same year, shipyard workers would submit compelling requests that the Cabot be renamed as the USS Lexington in honor of her fallen predecessor. On September 23rd of 1942, CV-16 would launch as the USS Lexington. It was subsequently commissioned on February 17th of 1943, and after a shakedown cruise through the Caribbean, it would travel the Panama Canal to join the Pacific Fleet. Sadly, later the same year, one of the carrier's first casualties was that of 1939 Heisman Trophy winner Niall Kinnock, whose plane, during a test flight, developed a serious oil leak and ended up crashing into the sea 4 miles from the ship. On August 9th of 1943, the Lexington would arrive at Pearl Harbor and would kick off its prestigious war career by participating in a raid on Tarawa, followed by an assault on Wake Island, after which she would join in raiding Kwajalein through December of the same year. Through October of 1944, CV-16 would participate in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which by some accounts was actually the largest naval battle in history, with over 200,000 naval personnel involved, and would later join in Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague's task force. Following the war, on April 23rd of 1947, the USS Lexington would finally get some rest when she was decommissioned. Initially, she was assigned to San Diego as a home port and would operate off the California coast until May of 1956, when she then sailed for a 6-month deployment with the 7th Fleet, and later, through June of 1957, embarked under Rear Admiral H.D. Riley's Commander Carrier Division 1 as a flagship, before returning to San Diego in October of the same year. Later, CV-16 would deploy on another Far Eastern tour from 1960 to 61 due to tensions in Laos. However, by 1962, she was ordered to return to the West Coast in order to relieve the Antietam as an aviation training carrier in the Gulf of Mexico. And while this was intended to be a more permanent position, the Lexington would return to action during the Cuban Missile Crisis and would not relieve the Antietam until late December of 1962. Up through 1969, the Lexington would call both Pensacola and Corpus Christi her home ports, and in 1991 would finally be relieved by the Forrestal, after which, through November of the same year, the Navy would turn her over to the city of Corpus Christi, and in June of 1992, she was donated as a museum, which the vessel operates as to this very day. The USS Lexington remains open to the public as a museum, and for those interested, tours of her decks are offered at select times. Not surprisingly, the hull of this aged vessel is absolutely saturated in tales of otherworldly phenomena, and those who have braved its bounds have reported doors that slam spontaneously, lights that flick on and off by themselves, and extreme cold patches felt in adverse weather conditions. In various rooms and hallways, a spectral sailor has been known to appear to those who have lost their way, in order to guide them back to the deck before disappearing, while others have described run-ins with shadowy figures and the feelings of being brushed up against or even tapped by unseen hands. Several informal investigations of the Lexington have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and hits on thermal grids, while others have described phantom wafts of tobacco smoke, the smells of food cooking, and bursts of old-timey cologne. Easily the most famous ghost story surrounding the USS Lexington is that of its iconic blue ghost. As it's told, the spirit of a good-natured sailor named Charlie who has piercing blue eyes and who it's believed was killed in a 1944 kamikaze attack has been passed over numerous times by visitors who think him either a staff member or an actor, only to turn for a moment to find that he's vanished from sight. Additionally, Charlie has been known to converse with the living at great lengths, and is particularly fond of speaking about the ship's mechanical features, which he is apparently very familiar with. Also reported across the Lexington are ghostly voices, disembodied footsteps, and the sounds of strange rumbles or explosions that are believed to be echoes from war times past. A strange fog has been known to settle around the ship alone on otherwise clear nights, and a handful of full-bodied apparitions believed to be the ghosts of former sailors have been observed going about daily tasks before fading away. Number 4 has us adventuring through remote countryside that spans across central Texas along a notable region known as the Devil's Backbone. The Devil's Backbone, which is located in the heart of Texas Hill Country, is a mysterious expanse surrounded by fascinating histories and all sorts of classic ghost stories and old hill legends. Notably, Texas Hill Country as a whole stretches north from just past Llano down to the edge of San Antonio in the south, then from Rock Springs in the west over to Austin at its eastern end. Geologically speaking, hill country, which honestly covers a good bulk of central and south Texas, and it forms the southeastern portion of the Edwards Plateau, includes areas with climate, terrain, and foliage textbook of both the American Southwest and Southeast, and boasts a range of small communities and back roads that cement it as a picture-perfect example of the massive state's remote countryside. While a majority of hill country is comprised of large limestone and granite outcroppings dotted with prickly pear cactus, yucca, desert spoon, and wildflowers, it also totes its fair share of rivers and creeks that are surrounded by lush greenery, including pines, Texas live oaks, and ash juniper, making for a beautiful natural contrast of landscapes. Historically speaking, the bulk of lands comprising Texas hill country were initially inhabited by tribes native to the region, including the Lipan Apaches and Tonkawas, who would set up communities namely through the 14th century. Later, through the 1700s and early 1800s, European immigrants, particularly those of German descent, would begin settling on these same lands, and eventually, homesteads would sprout up all over. Now, it may surprise some that through the Civil War, and namely due to its large German population, those living throughout hill country would actually oppose the state's secession from the Union, and subsequently, following Reconstruction, the core of the region was comprised of Republicans, whose party at that time was more like today's Democratic Party, and who would provide a solid base in a namely one-party Democratic state. In as late as the 1930s and 40s, and even while no Republicans were present in Texas legislature, both Gillespie and Kendall counties would back every Republican candidate nominee barring Herbert Hoover's failed 1932 re-election campaign, and the locale would remain predominantly Republican. Additionally, in 1924, Hill Country was the only region within antebellum slave states to back the candidacy of Robert La Follette, whose ticket was largely progressive for the era. To date, the Devil's Backbone, and all of Hill Country for that matter, remains a popular expanse for road trips, bonfires, shooting, fishing, hiking, and more, and totes an array of attractions that any traveling through the Lone Star State should definitely take the time to check out. But beyond its scenic vistas, poppin' roadhouses, and plentiful nature opportunities, the Devil's Backbone more than earns its rather ominous moniker through the sheer number of ghost stories surrounding it, and those driving the expanse have reported instances of vehicles picking up radio broadcasts from decades past, strange patches of smoke or fog that envelop lone cars on otherwise clear nights, and instances of phantom hitchhikers being picked up by unsuspecting motorists only to disappear mid-drive. Ghost stories across the Backbone are so plentiful and long-lived, in fact, that a local author, one Burt Wall, actually wrote a total of 8 books surrounding its various Old Hill folk legends, and was even in the process of finishing a 9th at the time of his passing. And some of his content included ghostly horse hoofbeats, tribal drums, strange chants, and apparitions in traditional native attire, alongside various cryptid sightings, phantom images of past car wrecks, and more. One more famous area of this expansive locale is the small but popular roadhouse-style bar placed smack dab between San Antonio and Austin called the Devil's Backbone Tavern. Built in 1937, this remote countryside haunt has seemingly always acted as a popular stop for travelers to smoke, drink, and tell good old-fashioned ghost stories right around its devil-shaped fireplace. And to date, supernatural activity within is so prevalent that a sign at the tavern reads, "Ghost warning. If doors and windows open and close by themselves, just ignore it. It's our ghost trying to get attention. He thinks it's funny." Incidentally, both staff and patrons of the tavern have reported TVs, radios, and other electronics behaving erratically, instances of glasses or personal effects that move on their own, disembodied footsteps and voices, and encounters with full-bodied apparitions that are mistaken for the living, but that always disappear in the blink of an eye. Some other popular Backbone legends told by those living across the region include encounters with the spirit of a native man named Drago, who is often sighted herding cattle, and the phantoms of a woman and child believed to be related to a miner who died somewhere near long ago, and whom some believe are simply seeking a proper Christian burial for their late patriarch. One particular stretch of road on the Backbone is locally known as Purgatory Road, and along it, a terrifying phantom form has been known to jump or manifest on the hoods of moving vehicles, nearly causing wrecks, and some have told of horrifying attacks from spirit animals known as ghost wolves, with one documentation detailing a John Villarreal, who, after enduring one such attack, was seemingly possessed for a time, and spoke to his friends in a demonic voice about past native massacres, before a cold wind swept through through the area, and he was returned to his normal state. Lastly, and experienced across the whole of the backbone are ghostly Confederate soldiers, accounts of children or animals reacting to unseen presences, and one unnerving encounter with a little girl sporting a gruesome hole in her head that it's believed was the spirit of someone tied to a family who got raided by a local tribe, and who ended up shooting herself to spare from the torture of being taken captive. Now, our fifth and final haunt takes us to San Antonio, to one of the most famous missions on Earth, being the legendary Alamo. The infinitely iconic Alamo, which is placed in San Antonio, Texas, is a historic Spanish Roman Catholic mission whose grounds are drenched in the blood of those lost in one of the most brutal confrontations to transpire on American soil, that are also shrouded in a range of chilling ghost stories and legends of the otherworldly. Historically, through the early 1700s, Spanish forces would establish a series of missions across East Texas, and the rather lengthy distance between them and the nearest Spanish settlement, being San Juan Bautista Coahuila, made it difficult to keep these sites adequately stocked, resulting in the government's desire to create a way station between settlements along the Rio Grande and these new fortifications. In April of 1718, then governor of Spanish Texas, Juan Martín de Alarcón, would lead an expedition to found a new community near the headwaters of the San Antonio River, and would set up a temporary mud, brush, and straw structure to serve as a new mission called San Antonio de Valero. A mile north of this mission, he would establish a fort called the Presidio San Antonio de Bejar, and close to that, he would plant the roots for what would eventually grow into our present-day city of San Antonio. Within a year, the aforementioned mission would be relocated to the western bank of the river in order to prevent flooding. Following the Gulf Coast hurricane of 1724, it was moved to its current site, and over subsequent decades, mission grounds would be expanded to over 3 acres. In 1744, some of the first stones for a more permanent church building were laid. However, this new site would face a total collapse through the 1750s. In 1758, reconstruction was started, and over subsequent decades, the site would host a population largely comprised of what were at the time known as Mission Indians, who would quarrel with local Apache and Comanche forces on and off, in between a series of expansions and upgrades predating its eventual abandonment. Through the early 19th century, the mission complex would come to be known as the Alamo. In 1803, the site would be occupied by the 2nd Flying Company of San Carlos de Parras. Through the Mexican War of Independence, it would serve as a military prison, and from 1806 to 1812, it would host San Antonio's first hospital. In 1821, the expanse would be transferred by the Spanish to Mexican forces, and soldiers would garrison there until 1835, when General Martín Perfecto de Cos surrendered to Texian forces, after which he would order his men to depart. Following Cos's departure, Colonel James C. Neal would assume command of the outpost and around 100 men, though he would send for a reinforcement of 200 more, and though most felt the war was over, Neal would express his fears that the Alamo was lacking in supplies, and that his men could be starved out in as little as a 4-day siege. Unfortunately, however, the Texian government was preoccupied with rebuilding itself and could offer little assistance. Eventually, General Sam Houston would send out a party of 35 to 50 men headed by Colonel James Bowie, the infamous knife fighter and Old West legend, who brought the signature blade named after himself, being the Bowie knife, to prominence through a particularly brutal duel. Now, normally I wouldn't stray off here, but the infamous sandbar fight out of Natchez, Mississippi definitely deserves a shout out. During the aforementioned duel, Bowie would draw his knife against multiple armed opponents, including the sheriff of Rapids Parish, one Norris Wright. Almost immediately, Bowie would be shot through the hip, after which Wright would actually stab him square through the chest with his cane sword. Surprisingly though, when the sheriff placed his foot atop Bowie's body in order to try and pull his sword out, old Jim would reach up and yank right down to his level before disemboweling him with his impressive 9¼ knife. Bowie would then regain his footing and, with the cane sword still protruding from his torso, would proceed to soak up further gunshots and stab wounds before defeating his remaining attackers, all while cementing his reputation as pretty much one of the biggest badasses around. Jumping forward to the Alamo, Bowie was joined in the defense of the mission by the king of the wild frontier himself, Davy Crockett, as well as by William B. Travis and a host of brave soldiers who, on January 26th of 1836, would pass a resolution in favor of holding the Alamo at all costs. On February 23rd, the much larger Mexican army headed by President General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna would arrive at the Alamo, intent on taking it and the surrounding city. For a total of 13 days, the Mexican army of thousands would lay relentless siege to the hundreds of entrenched Texian men. This battle would culminate on March 6th when Santa Anna's men overran the mission's walls, after which remaining Texian soldiers, which included Bowie, Crockett, and Travis, would fall back to the convent and fought to their final breaths. The last surviving Texians were a group of 11 men manning two 12-pound cannons within the chapel. Following barricades being destroyed by Mexican artillery and with no time to reload, instead of surrendering, these men picked up the nearest rifles they could muster, fired, and then proceeded to charge before falling to bayonets. While one Texian, Robert Evans, who was a master of ordnance, who'd been mortally wounded through combat, and who'd been tasked with keeping their gunpowder from Mexican forces, actually crawled with a torch in his hand to the stores, attempting to blow the entire stockpile before he was shot dead. Had Roberts actually succeeded, the chapel, along with all encroaching Mexican soldiers, would have been annihilated entirely. Shockingly, when all was said and done, Mexican casualties totaled around 600 or maybe even more, which represented around a third of the assaulting force, a feat that stands eerily reminiscent of a certain Spartan king who held his ground against a Persian empire over 1300 years prior. Following the battle, Santa Anna would unceremoniously order all bodies of Texans stacked in piles and burned, and while Mexican forces would claim a temporary victory and would fortify the mission for a time, their actions on that day would strongly influence a response in the Battle of San Jacinto through April of the same year, and following this devastating loss, their army would agree to leave Texas alone. Through December of 1836 and January of 39, Texan forces would briefly occupy the Alamo. Through January of 1841, the Republic of Texas would return sanctuary of the Alamo to the Roman Catholic Church. And while in 1846, military forces would occupy the site once more, eventually, the Texas Supreme Court would reaffirm its ownership under the Catholic Church. Through the Civil War, the Confederate Army would claim the Alamo. In 1876, all military present would be transferred to the new Fort Sam Houston out of San Antonio, and in 1883, the church would sell the site to the state of Texas, after which it would change hands a number of times moving forward. Through the 1900s, local government would begin preservation efforts of the Alamo and a small portion of its surrounding lands. Through the Great Depression, the Works Progress and National Youth Administrations would raise money to replace a wall around the site while constructing a museum, and in 1960, the weathered old church would be registered as a National Historic Landmark. In the present, the Alamo stands as a testament to Texas and to American bravery as a whole, and welcomes millions of visitors annually, while hosting a number of events and offering a handful of educational opportunities. Shocking exactly no one when considering its long and bloody history, the Alamo is widely considered one of the most haunted places not just in Texas, but in the whole of the United States, and those braving its bounds have reported a host of chilling activity, including instances of extreme cold patches felt through hot Texan summers, objects sighted moving around on their own, and ominous shadowy figures that tend to observe living visitors from a distance. But ghost stories surrounding the Alamo are not a new concept. Incidentally, just days after the battle, Santa Anna would send a Mexican troop to scout out the area, and what they'd report would both shock and terrify the general. Upon arriving to the mission, the entire troop swore they witnessed a handful of fiery guardian spirits with swords that were so horrifying to behold, it caused them to immediately flee the scene. Eventually, Santa Anna would order his soldiers to tear the Alamo down. However, after they'd started the process, it's told that ghostly hands shot out from the walls, stopping them in their tracks. These hands were believed to belong to the spirits of the site's founding monks, and when the naive general attempted to continue the demolition, it's then said that a thundering voice rained down from above and ordered him to immediately stop his raising or that he would face a swift and painful death. Needless to say, Santa Anna halted his orders on the spot. Several informal investigations of the Alamo have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and hits on communicative devices, while others have reported windows and doors that open and close by themselves, instances of lights flicking on and off sporadically, and within the gift shop, disembodied voices are commonly heard calling out random names. Some more frequently encountered apparitions at the Alamo include the full-bodied entity of a soldier sighted running atop the mission, seemingly looking for an escape, the manifestation of a peaceful monk that usually appears praying in the courtyard, ghostly men observed in various areas, some of which sport grievous wounds, and that have even been encountered on nearby streets, often by guests of the Menger Hotel, and the creepy little giggles of children that were murdered on site. Reported across the whole of the Alamo and confined to no area in particular are the eerie sounds of a woman heard sobbing, phantom footsteps, and pounding noises that emanate from thin air, hoofbeats without source, and instances of furniture within the main hall shaking or even moving around inexplicably. A spectral figure in a black cloak has been known to manifest suddenly and disappear when approached. The spirits of those piled up and burned have been sighted in nearby streets, and the apparition of a young cowboy in Old West attire has been observed wandering about, and appears so real that he's often mistaken for an actor before he vanishes in the blink of an eye. Last but not least, the entity of Jim Bowie has been sighted from time to time, with his knife drawn and a fire in his eyes, while the mournful spirit of Davy Crockett has been viewed perched on various walls, gazing out over the horizon with a solemn look, some say, as he contemplates his sacrifice. Thanks all for joining me on this exploration through some of the most haunted places in the great state of Texas. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. I'll see you all next time.